Starting in October of 2022, Henny Penny will be using the new Generation 4 type selector valve motor on the Evolution Elite gas fryers to replace the previous Generation 3 style for both production units and service parts moving forward. This Generation 4 motor will replace this Generation 3 selector valve motor and will be a direct replacement for when needing to replace Generation 3 motors in the field. This new selector valve has a few differences compared to the previous Generation 3 type motor, but operates very similar. A few differences to note are the LED status lights on the new Generation 4 type motor. These are lights for diagnostics that will help in determining when it comes to troubleshooting. Also, we have a separate plug for the harness between the motor and the AIF board. This separate harness can now be replaceable without having to replace the entire motor assembly. Also, the new Gen 4 style encoder motor will use a different style recessed mounting bolt that use a straight bladed screwdriver rather than the previous Generation 3 type shoulder bolts that uses a 1/8 of an inch hex key wrench. With the new Generation 4 style encoder motor using a longer shaft for the motor assembly, this requires no longer needing the previous Generation 3 style coupler. So now when replacing these encoder motors in the field with Generation 4, this direct drive coupler is no longer needed. With this coupler removed, now the Generation 4 maintains the ability to connect to the original 10-port selector valve with ease. Tools needed to replace the encoder motor in the field would be a powered screwdriver, a wide tip flat-bladed screwdriver to align the selector valve shaft on the selector valve body to make sure it's lined up with home port 10. Also, a short flat-bladed screwdriver, a regular size flat-bladed screwdriver. Also, to remove the old mounting bolts for the Generation 3 encoder motor, we will need an 1/8 of an inch hex key wrench, as well as a 5/16 nut driver. And last but not least, we want to make sure that we have a few zip ties and then some angled cutters to be able to cut these zip ties for cleanliness. When replacing a Generation 3 style encoder motor on a unit in the field with the new Generation 4 style encoder motor, you will need to start by turning the unit off, unplugging it from its power source, and then remove the right side panel as well as the rear access panel. Now we can remove the 3 mounting bolts for our blower motor so that we can gain better access to the selector valve encoder motor. With the mounting bolts removed, we can now set our blower motor off to the side so that we have better access to our selector valve. Using an 1/8 of an inch hex key wrench, we will now remove the 3 mounting bolts that bolt the encoder motor to our selector valve. Now that we have our 3 1/8 of an inch hex key mounting bolts removed, now we can lift up on the selector valve encoder motor and now set it off to the side. Remove the orange O-ring. Now that we have the encoder motor removed, we need to remove the original coupler before installing the new Generation 4 style encoder motor. With the encoder motor setting off to the side and our coupler removed, we can now come up to our connections at the AIF board and go ahead and unplug those from the original harness. We will have the power supply here, and then we will have our communication cable here. We will squeeze those tabs to unplug those, and now what we need to do is remove this plastic protection sleeve so that we can be able to shove these wires through the conduit. Pro tip is we can use needle nose pliers to squeeze those tabs to go ahead and pull that sleeve through. Once we have the sleeve pulled through, now we can feed our wires through this channel and out the protective sleeve with both our communication and our power supply connection. Once we have that removed, now we can grab our entire encoder motor assembly and set it off to the side. With our new harness in hand, we'll now need to feed this back through our protective sleeve and into the AIF enclosure. First with our communication cable, and then second with our power supply connector. We can feed that through. Now we can take and push our protector sleeve back into place. Then we can take and connect our power supply, as well as our communication cable. We'll go ahead and leave this off to the side for just a moment, and now we're going to focus our attention to the selector valve body. What we need to do before connecting the encoder motor to the top of the selector valve is we need to take a wide tip, flat bladed screwdriver and make sure that these alignment dots on the top of the selector valve shaft are lined up with home port 10. It is critical that this step is done so that proper calibration by the encoder motor can be performed. With our selector valve body lined up properly, now we can go ahead and plug in our communication cable to the encoder motor right here. Now this connector only plugs in one way, so there's no way to get it confused. You can see that it's snapped into place there. Now with our encoder motor communication cable harness plugged in, before we connect the encoder motor to the valve body, it's important that we plug the unit in and turn on our main power switch so that we can properly calibrate the encoder motor before attaching it to the valve body. Now that we have the unit powered up and turned on, you can see that the shaft is turning so that it can calibrate itself before we connect it to the valve. You can also see here we have our LED indicator lights, and this is indicating that the unit has power and that it's also at the home position. Now that we have calibrated the encoder motor, we can go ahead and turn the unit back off so that we can now attach the encoder motor to the valve body. When attaching the encoder motor to the valve body, we need to make sure that the shaft on the encoder motor as well as the cutout on the shaft of the valve body are lined up properly. This will only go on one way to the valve body, so if we make sure that our holes line up as well, that will help get us a close alignment for a proper fit. And now that we have that on there, we can see how easy that went into place. This is where we can proceed with installing the new 3 flat-bladed screws that came with the new encoder motor. To finish up this motor replacement, now we can take and neatly zip tie our new harness in the original AIF enclosure to make sure that we have a nice clean install. It's important to note when zip tying back here by the hot filtration components, we want to try to keep those away from the drain trough or the oil lines as much as possible. So zip tying to electrical conduit can help that. Now that the motor replacement process is finished, we can proceed with putting our blower motor back on, as well as our side and rear panels, and then proceed with running a filtration afterwards to check and make sure everything is okay.